Hey guys, so what I did for this video is basically survey the players in the Labrynth Duelist Facebook and Discord groups just to gather their thoughts in terms of, what are the key strengths, weaknesses of Labrynth, and much more. So definitely a huge thanks to all of you who responded and shared the survey. We had 136 players respond, which is a new record for this type of video, so I'm really excited as we continue to do this for other strategies, and I've definitely read all the responses, and I guess shout out to you, Stevie. I know you wanted a shout out in the responses. So anyways, you can also check me out on Twitter to make sure that you don't miss out on any future surveys. And of course, definitely want to highlight those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles and supplies. Remember, Card Brawlers and Tier 0 games, they both have their singles up for that rarity reprint set. And also, definitely go check out the new Dragon Shield discount codes. You can use code Hakuna5 for 5% off on all of these wonderful companies. So now let's just get started right with the video. In terms of how the pilots would rate the difficulty of piloting Labrynth, it came to an average about 6.9. Now I know that a lot of trap decks typically get like the stereotype of being quote unquote brain dead to play, but realistically Labrynth definitely do not think that way for this deck. It does require a lot of skill to be able to pilot this deck really well. There's definitely clear notable differences between a good and bad Labrynth player, and you can certainly check out my previous deck profiles of Labrynth players on my channel. Of course, Ryan Yu being one of the most well-known players, and also my good friend Tien, who actually topped Niagara Regionals back-to-back with Labrynth as well. Now in terms of how they would rate the consistency of the deck, about 7.5. So honestly, that's like pretty good, especially considering that it's kind of like a back row oriented deck, although not really the same as kind of like your traditional back row decks, at least if they're playing like the furniture version. So I think it's pretty solid and something that we can also touch a little bit more as we get to the video. Now in terms of what tier the Labrynth players would categorize this deck under, it was mostly in tier 2, and realistically I think with the survey videos lately in the past month, I think I've really been trying to cover just mostly all the tier 2 decks, because I sort of covered all the tier 1 decks already like a couple months prior, but certainly something that I look forward to as I continue to do these type of videos. So in terms of the key strengths of Labrynth, I tried my best to summarize what the respondents provided, and first, of course, a very strong ground game as kind of like a back row oriented deck. Inherently you're known to be have a very good strong ground game, as well as just like the resource looping in terms of like all the furnitures kind of coming back, as well as let's say something like Lovely that can set like another trap, for example, from the graveyard, and of course a good amount of space for non-engine, which is always nice, especially for kind of like back row decks, which traditionally they typically struggle going second, just being a back row deck. But realistically, I would say most modern meta decks nowadays usually have a good amount of space for non-engine, so that's not really kind of like an exceptional strength for Labrynth or anything. I mean, obviously there's some exceptions, let's say like Tier Elements or like Branded Despia. Of course, that's not a tier 1 deck, but those decks are known to have not much non-engine space, but at least it's always nice to be flexible. Also having access to very strong normal traps such as Eradicator, or let's say like Dimensional Barrier, which can be a blowout depending on which deck you play against. Of course, maybe you can even play something like, I don't know, Different Dimension Ground, which kind of serves as like a shifter but just for monsters. So it definitely has access to these normal trap cards, direct access rather, through the Lady effect, which is of course something that's kind of new for a trap deck. And also, of course, being able to play under most Floodgates, again, because they're kind of a trap deck, they're probably playing the Floodgates themselves, although not always, of course, depends on kind of like the Labrynth build you're playing, but we'll also touch on which Floodgates might actually affect Labrynth as well later. In terms of how the pilots would rate the deck's ability to go first, 8.6, that's quite high. Of course, these are like subjective measures, but at the same time, again, backward decks, traditionally you want to be able to go first, and they usually have a lot of advantage by being able to go first and just having like that very strong ground game, and just very kind of hard to keep up with for a lot of decks. Going second, of course, again, as I mentioned repeatedly at this point, kind of backward decks usually struggle going second, and 5.5, I mean, that's pretty low. Of course, realistically, when I go against Labrynth, I feel like I'm always kind of scared when they go second, just because they can play something like, let's say, like, I don't know, Sphere Mode, Lava Golem, just like really easily break boards. But of course that's also kind of format dependent, depending on the type of board that the whatever meta decks are producing at the moment. If it's a lot of layered interruptions, yeah, it can still be quite hard for back row decks. Now in terms of the typical end board for Labrynth, of course for this deck it's going to be set 5 pass, right? I'm kidding, guys. So anyways, all jokes aside, for the typical end board for Labrynth, at least based on the survey respondents, honestly I actually kind of found it hard to provide what a typical end board is, because for one, I felt a lot of the responses kind of seemed like more so an ideal end board rather than typical, but nonetheless just kind of go over like the type of interactions or interruptions that are available for Labrynth in general. The most common kind of response was essentially having some form of access to Lovely or Lady through Welcome or Big Welcome Labrynth. A lot of players players mentioned, you know, having that lovely lovely setup for that either hand rip or maybe pop in the field. Of course, you know, on like your future turns, like you can also set traps using Lovely's effect, and also having some form of furniture access, you know, in the graveyard hand. They do eventually kind of like come back, and of course these are the cards that helps you set, you know, something like Big Welcome or Welcome, if you, especially if you didn't open any of them, and Coup Clock being really good as well in terms of actually being able to play it the same turn that you set it. But I believe this is actually more of a one of in most Labrynth lists. Of course, there's other interruptions, and you know, Lady is a very big one for Labrynth as well. Just not only is it kind of like a free body essentially whenever you use like some Labrynth card, but you know, just being able to, as long as you have another trap that you can activate along with it, at least Lady can also set another trap directly, a normal trap directly from the deck, something like, let's say, D-Barrier, Eradicator, depending on whatever matchup you have. So also a very, very strong card that you have to be aware of when you're playing Labrynth. You know, Ariana came up a lot, especially in terms of like, you know, quote unquote typical end board. You know, at least it helps you get access to like your Labrynth engine. And of course, I kind of just put Arias here just because it is a new card after all from Age of Overlord, and I guess it can help with like, I don't know, turn 0 D-Barrier, but realistically this actually did not come up that much in the responses. And I believe this is just like a one of in pretty much every Labrynth list. So now let's move on to which hand traps played by the opponent is most impactful against Labrynth, and you can use this sort of as like a side deck guide, and if you play Labrynth yourself, maybe you can see how your fellow Labrynth players feel about the deck. And of course, number one is Ash, and also Bella's also up there as well on like the Big Welcome Labrynth, and Ash on like Welcome. Just preventing that access to something like those Lady and Lovely is definitely really integral in keeping this deck in check. They also mentioned a lot about cards that, you know, kind of like banish, so you have something like Bestials, you have Crow, even Shifter, and just, you know, because a lot of times like for this deck, like if the cards banished, like they're basically just gone, right? Like something like Lovely, for example, so can be really strong, and especially Bestials and Crow, you know, like being like quick effects and just like preventing also, you know, something like Lady from setting so that you force it to miss timing, for example. Imperm Veiler, you know, like those targeted negations, they did mention you can kind of play around that by, let's say, like Big Welcome, activating Big Welcome, because it can just like bounce back the Fiend, and you know, you can kind of dodge that as well. Now, in terms of like cards like Droll, I think maybe the respondents got a little confused here. Maybe they thought I was asking what hand traps they play themselves, because honestly, like Droll would not be a good side deck option for Labrynth. In terms of the key board breakers that are most impactful against Labrynth, of course you have the back row removal cards, really high up there: Feather Duster, Lightning Storm, and of course this technically depends on, you know, like which build you're on, in terms of, you know, Furniture or Floodgate, because of course the Floodgate version will have more sets. At the same time, based on like the survey respondents, it seemed like, or responses rather, it seemed like most were on the Furniture build. Admittedly, that's something I should have probably asked as a separate question, but you know, I'm not like some Labrynth expert, so I didn't really have the foresight to do that, unfortunately. Evenly Match, of course, can be very good. At least it also just completely banishes face down. They did mention though that, you know, they can play something like Big Welcome to at least like clear their field a little bit, whereas also Feather Duster and Lightning Storm, something to mention is, you know, if they have like Lord of the Heavenly Prison, which they can typically side as well, you know, that can just protect against something like Destruction like Feather Duster and Lightning Storm, whereas Cosmic Cyclone again is another banishing, which is really nice. And they actually mentioned how this on like, let's say, like Big Welcome, just to prevent it from just being able to come back essentially, is also actually quite impactful as well. Super Poly is also really nice. They are Dark Fiends, so you know, you can go into like Garura, and especially when, let's say, if they do play Skill Drain and you're kind of struggling against them, being able to clear those big Lady and Lovely bodies off the field with Super Poly is also quite nice. And the rest of the board breakers honestly were just like really, there's a big drop off, so they're not nearly as good, right? Like Regeki Dark Hole, I mean, realistically, like let's say like Lady not having card destruction protection, Dropwood honestly has not really come up for me. The only time it kind of came up was actually like the stat modification part, just to be able to like attack over like that Lady or Lovely, but otherwise these cards are certainly not nearly as sad as much against Labrynth. And finally, in terms of the Floodgates that are also impactful against Labrynth, there can be only one was definitely kind of like up there. Of course, you know, in general, this deck is not really going to struggle against most Floodgates, being kind of like a back row oriented deck themselves, but there can be only one, as I mentioned, you know, they are Fiends, so yeah, that's definitely going to hurt. Grave of the Super Ancient Organism, this one's kind of interesting. This is a card that I was actually kind of worried about for this format, at least for me, being a Branded Despia player, just because this card is just straight up FTK against Branded. But, you know, it's kind of interesting because, you know, usually you typically only see this from like Runic decks, for example, like Sprite versions as well. So like I've even seen Flunder play this as well. I'm not really sure if this is actually going to see some play. I'm very interested to see how YCS Richmond's going to go. Zombie World is another one that seems to be more of a nuisance, where, for example, let's say like whatever trap you set off of, you know, like Lovely, you do need a Fiend to be able to activate that trap. And, you know, with Zombie World, they would turn into zombies. Same thing with like the Big Welcome Graveyard effect. You do have to, like, you know, bounce back like a Fiend, or you control a level 8 or a higher Fiend and you can bounce like your opponent's monster. But again, they would be zombies at this point. And the rest of the Floodgates, honestly, again, I think at this point, players probably got confused maybe in terms of, you know, maybe they thought I was asking, you know, oh, like what Floodgates do you play, and not really, you know, what Floodgates impact them. I mean, D-Barrier, I mean, I guess, you know, I guess they have some synchro plays with like Chaos Angel, but realistically, it's not something you would side against Labrynth, right? Some other Floodgates I did not have as an actual option, but some people did put in the comments. Of course, Royal Decree, just shutting down traps, sure, of course, but, you know, this card is not seeing any play. At one point a while ago, earlier this year, it saw a little bit of play, just because right when Labrynth became the tier 1, or at least meta, we also had the introduction of the Trap Trick structure deck, so there were some, I know, lists that were playing Royal Decree, but realistically not much. Necro Valley is another one that certainly can really end a lot of decks, especially like tier limits right now. So you know what, these are Floodgates that I decided not to put in the graph, just because, you know, if I actually had them as a direct option on the survey, I'm sure a lot more people would have chosen it, so I don't think the data was very clean for this one. But moving forward in the future surveys, I will add these Floodgates into those survey questions. Now, lastly, in terms of, you know, what are the key weaknesses of Labrynth? So the players mentioned, you know, just being very weak to Ash, slash Bell on, you know, Welcome, Big Welcome. Like, this was a very, very common thing that was mentioned in most responses, you know, because preventing their Lady slash Lovely from coming out really, really is a big hindrance. Going second, this is just kind of like, as mentioned before, you know, a back row oriented deck. Usually it's quite hard for them to be able to go second in a lot of formats, but of course kind of dependent. And also just like not having a way to get back your banished resources. That's why in that hand trap section, you know, cards like Bestials, Crows, and even D-Shifter sometimes can be really, really impactful against something like Labrynth. And finally, just decks with chainable interactions. So a Sentry, this is because, you know, let's say something, key example is Lady, where, you know, you can miss timing with Lady, basically, you know, when they activate a trap, and if your opponent activates anything that as a quick effect, let's say for example like Bestials, or let's say, you know, like Pearly in this instance because it's very popular, you know, any other quick play spells, then Lady will actually miss timing and will not be able to set a normal trap from deck. So those are kind of things that the Labrynth deck can be weak to. Anyways, guys, that is it for this breakdown of Labrynth. Hopefully you found that interesting. Definitely feel free to provide recommendations on which deck I should cover next in terms of surveying. Just keeping in mind of all the other decks that I've surveyed so far. You know, I think I might go with Vanquish Soul next. Rescue Ace, I've already done it, but realistically, maybe I should do it again just because of the new Diabell Star engine. And now it's kind of like, it's considered as one of the, if not the best deck in the format. I mean, Sprite is another option, but I think for that, I'm a little bit worried that, you know, there's so many different Sprite variants. It might be a little bit hard to do that, but anyways, definitely feel free to recommend some decks that I can survey. So with that being said, definitely a huge thanks to all of you for watching this video. Big thanks to my patrons as always for supporting the channel as always. Definitely go check out those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh singles as well as sleeves. Really helps out. And anyways, guys, take care.